There is something almost impossible about the crisis now surrounding the British monarchy. A man who was once a prince, once a working royal, once photographed beside kings, queens, and presidents, was arrested and questioned by police for nearly 12 hours. His former home was searched. Investigators began examining allegations connected not merely to his private life, but to the period when he represented Britain abroad. And when the news reached the palace, King Charles did something that may prove far more important than any dramatic public confrontation. He did not rescue his brother. He did not attack the investigation. He did not attempt to place the monarchy between Andrew Mountbatten Windsor and the authorities. Instead, the message was devastatingly simple. The law must take its course. Andrew, who denies wrongdoing, remains under investigation. But while Charles stepped away from the legal battlefield, something else was happening inside the royal story. Because the future king was watching. And Prince William has spent years forming a very different idea of what happens when one member of the family threatens the survival of the institution. That is why this story is not really about Andrew. It is about the moment a monarchy facing one of its gravest modern crises may have begun behaving as though the next reign has already entered the room. And later, there is an even more uncomfortable question. If William has learned that the crown survives by cutting away anything that threatens it, what happens when the next threat comes from someone much closer to him? To understand why this matters, you have to understand the strange position King Charles now occupies. Charles is not simply a brother dealing with another brother's scandal. He is the sovereign. Those two roles are almost impossible to separate emotionally, yet constitutionally they must remain separate. A brother may want explanations. A brother may feel anger, loyalty, humiliation, grief, or even pity. But a king cannot treat the machinery of justice as a family meeting behind palace doors. And that distinction became brutally clear in February 2026. Andrew Mountbatten Windsor was arrested on suspicion of misconduct in public office as police investigated matters connected to his dealings with Jeffrey Epstein. After hours of questioning, he was released under investigation. By July, police were still pursuing lines of inquiry, including plans to speak with Virginia Giuffre's relatives. Andrew has consistently denied wrongdoing. For Buckingham Palace, the symbolism was almost impossible to exaggerate. This was not merely another embarrassing headline. Andrew had already lost almost everything that once connected him publicly to royal life. In October 2025, Charles stripped his younger brother of his remaining royal titles and forced him to leave Royal Lodge, with Prince William reported to have supported the decision. The palace had tried to build a wall, Andrew on one side, the working monarchy on the other. Then came the arrest. And suddenly the wall no longer looked high enough. That was the first twist. Because the strategy had been separation. Strip away the titles, remove the official status, move him away from the center, and demonstrate that Andrew Mountbatten Windsor was no longer functioning as a representative of the crown. But a family connection cannot be removed by decree. Charles was still his brother, William was still his nephew, Queen Elizabeth II had still been his mother, and every fresh photograph, allegation, or police development dragged the monarchy's name back into a story the palace had desperately tried to quarantine. Reuters described the arrest as confronting the royals with their worst crisis in roughly 90 years. That description matters, because institutions reveal themselves differently during crises. When everything is calm, tradition controls the rhythm. Engagements are planned months ahead, speeches are approved, ceremonies follow patterns established generations ago. But when something unpredictable happens, people discover where authority really sits. And this is where Charles and William become fascinating. Charles's instinct has often been gradualism. For decades he waited. He waited to become Prince of Wales in substance as well as title. He waited to marry Camilla publicly. He waited longer than any heir in British history to become king. His entire life trained him in patience. William grew up with a different education. His formative experience of monarchy was not waiting, it was crisis. He was 15 when Diana died. He watched an institution that had seemed permanent suddenly face extraordinary public anger. He saw crowds gathering outside palace gates. He saw flowers covering Kensington Palace. He saw a queen who had represented continuity for decades forced to respond to a national emotional convulsion unlike anything the modern monarchy had experienced. William learned something very young that Charles had learned much more gradually. The crown can be ancient and still vulnerable, and once public trust begins to move, the palace does not necessarily control where it goes. That lesson appears again and again in the way William has approached the future. In 2025, speaking about the monarchy he hopes eventually to lead, William publicly described himself as someone who enjoys change and wants to question how things are done. Royal historians noted that this did not necessarily amount to criticism of Charles, and the two men have continued appearing together publicly. But the difference in temperament is becoming harder to ignore. Charles inherited an institution. William appears increasingly interested in redesigning one. And Andrew became the perfect test. Years before the arrest, William was reportedly far less willing than some around the family to believe the scandal could simply be contained. A 2026 biography reported that William had wanted Andrew decisively removed from royal life after the disastrous 2019 Newsnight interview because he saw the controversy as a threat to the monarchy itself. Think about what that means. William's concern was not merely whether Andrew had embarrassed the family, it was systemic. What happens to the crown if the public begins believing royal status protects people from consequences? What happens if palace loyalty looks more important than institutional credibility? And perhaps most importantly, what happens when postponing a difficult decision only makes the eventual decision more painful? That is where the crisis becomes much larger, because by the time Charles removed Andrew's remaining titles in 2025, years of controversy had already accumulated. Then the police investigation arrived. The crown had acted. But events had moved again. And now Charles confronted a situation in which doing more could itself create danger. A British monarch cannot order police investigations. He cannot decide whether someone should be prosecuted. He cannot simply remove an individual from the statutory line of succession on his own authority. When discussion emerged about Parliament potentially removing Andrew from the succession, royal sources indicated Buckingham Palace would not oppose such action. Notice the language. Not lead it, not demand it, not fight it. Do not stand in the way. That may sound passive. Constitutionally, it is anything but. The modern monarchy survives partly because it knows where royal authority must stop. And so Charles's refusal to intervene can be interpreted not as weakness, but as the ultimate expression of the limits of kingship. Yet that creates a vacuum of another kind. If Charles cannot control the legal process, somebody still has to control the monarchy's response to it, its future image, its boundaries, its personnel, its message. And increasingly, every road leads toward William. But then something happened that complicated the picture. The monarchy kept working, Charles continued public duties, William continued engagements, Catherine continued her carefully managed return to public life. In August, William and Catherine appeared with George, Charlotte, and Louis at the Commonwealth Games in Scotland, an outing that visibly placed not merely the Prince of Wales, but the next generation of the monarchy before the public. That might look completely unrelated to Andrew. It isn't. The most powerful response a hereditary institution can make to a crisis involving its past is to display its future. William, Catherine, George, Charlotte, Louis. There is no dramatic palace declaration required. The image itself carries the message. Look forward. And this is where the story turns from family scandal into succession strategy. Because William does not need to become king to influence what the monarchy will look like under William. He already controls the Duchy of Cornwall. He already manages his own household. He already chooses which causes receive his attention. He already decides how much access the public receives to his children. And as heir, every decision he makes is evaluated not simply as the action of a prince, but as a preview, a rehearsal, a statement of intent. That does not mean Charles has surrendered control of the monarchy. There is no evidence of some secret abdication or formal transfer of sovereign authority. In fact, arguments that Charles was preparing to step aside were weakened by his continued schedule and successful public engagements in 2026. But formal power is only one kind of power. There is also expectation, and expectation has begun moving toward William. That is the unexpected discovery at the center of this entire crisis. The most important transfer occurring inside the monarchy may not involve constitutional documents at all. It may involve public psychology. For decades, Charles was the future. Now he is the present. William is the future. And whenever the present enters turbulence, attention automatically moves one generation forward. What would William do? Would he be tougher? Would he reduce the number of people considered part of the royal circle? Would he close the door permanently on relatives capable of damaging the institution? Would he modernize faster than Charles? Those questions once belonged to some distant reign. They no longer feel distant, and Andrew's crisis accelerated them. However, this is where William faces a trap. Cut too little, and the monarchy appears unwilling to protect its reputation. Cut too aggressively, and the royal family begins to look cold, divided, and ruthless. The crown depends on mystique, but it also depends on family. Christmas photographs, balcony appearances, weddings, children, generations standing beside one another. The monarchy sells continuity partly through blood, which means every time William draws a harder boundary around the institution, he protects the crown while potentially shrinking the family story that makes the crown emotionally powerful. And Andrew may not be the hardest test. Prince Harry is. That is the larger secret waiting behind everything else. In July 2026, Charles met Harry's children at Highgrove during another tentative movement in the long-running family estrangement. The meeting represented a significant step after years of distance between Charles and Harry. For Charles, that conflict contained something Andrew's crisis does not. Hope. Andrew is a brother whose official royal life has effectively been dismantled. Harry is a son. Archie and Lilibet are grandchildren. Charles can separate the institution from Andrew while still experiencing the consequences privately. But Harry forces a different question. Can the king repair a relationship as a father without creating complications for the crown? And what if William's answer is different from Charles's? That is where a future royal crisis could become far more serious than anything happening today. Because Andrew sits well outside the center of succession. Harry does not. He is the king's son. He is William's brother. And whatever his current role, his story is permanently attached to William's. William, therefore, has to accomplish something extraordinarily difficult. He must prepare to inherit the monarchy without appearing to wait for it. He must demonstrate authority without challenging his father. He must modernize without insulting tradition. He must defend the institution without making every family relationship look transactional. And he must do all of this while raising the boy who will one day inherit exactly the same impossible burden. Prince George is 13. At public events, we are already watching the early stages of that education. Not a constitutional education yet. Something subtler. How to stand, when to speak, when to smile, how long to wave, how to remain composed while hundreds of cameras capture every expression. Royal childhood is preparation disguised as family life. And William knows better than almost anyone what that preparation costs. That may explain one of the defining contradictions of the Prince of Wales. He appears determined to protect his children from excessive royal exposure, while simultaneously preparing George for a destiny that cannot be avoided if the monarchy continues. In other words, William is trying to solve the same problem Charles failed to solve for him. How do you raise a future king without allowing the crown to consume the child? And suddenly Andrew's crisis matters again. Because scandals do not only affect today's monarchy, they become part of George's inheritance. Every unresolved question William receives from Charles becomes something William must either settle or pass onward. This is why the Andrew problem was never just Andrew's problem. It belonged to Elizabeth. Then Charles, now increasingly William, and potentially George. That is how institutions accumulate danger. One generation postpones a difficult decision. The next inherits not only the decision, but the cost of the delay. Yet there is another twist. Charles may understand this perfectly. Consider what he has already done. He stripped Andrew's remaining royal titles. He removed him from royal lodge. When Andrew was arrested, Charles publicly emphasized that the legal process must proceed. When Parliament considered the succession question, the palace signaled that it would not stand in the way. Perhaps Charles's apparent refusal to intervene is not an absence of strategy. Perhaps it is the strategy. Do what the king constitutionally can, then stop. Do not transform Andrew's legal problems into a battle between the palace and the state. Do not create the impression that royal blood changes the rules. Do not allow a brother's fate to consume the sovereign's entire reign and leave the future architecture of the monarchy to the man who will eventually inhabit it. William. That interpretation changes everything. Because it means the apparent power shift between father and son does not necessarily require a feud. It might be cooperation. Charles protects the constitutional position of the crown. William protects its future cultural position. One manages what the monarchy is permitted to do. The other increasingly defines what the monarchy will refuse to tolerate. But no strategy can control what happens next. The police investigation involving Andrew is continuing, and authorities have described the inquiry as complex. No criminal conviction has been established, and Andrew denies wrongdoing. That creates the final countdown. Another major investigative development could place the monarchy back under extraordinary scrutiny. Parliament could face renewed questions. Old records could be examined again. Former officials could be asked what they knew. Decisions taken years or even decades ago could suddenly become politically relevant. And every time that happens, William will be forced to consider the same question. How much of the old monarchy can the new monarchy afford to carry? The answer may define his reign before it even begins. Because monarchies rarely collapse in a single dramatic moment. They weaken when the public stops believing the institution understands the rules everyone else must live by. That is the true danger. Not embarrassment, not bad headlines, not even family conflict. Loss of legitimacy. Charles understands that. William understands it too. They simply arrived at the lesson from different directions. Charles spent 70 years waiting for the crown and learned that kingship survives through restraint. William spent his childhood watching the crown survive catastrophe and learned that survival sometimes requires action. Now, those two philosophies are meeting in the same palace. One man is king, the other is not. But somewhere between them sits the future of the monarchy. And perhaps that is why the quietest part of this crisis is also the most important. There has been no extraordinary televised address, no dramatic appearance from the palace gates, no public confrontation between father and son. Instead, Charles continues. William prepares. Andrew remains outside official royal life as an investigation continues. And George watches. 4 men, 4 positions in the same family story. The disgraced former prince, the aging sovereign, the impatient future, and the child who may inherit whatever survives. For more than 1,000 years, the British monarchy has endured wars, abdications, revolutions, assassinations, divorces, scandals, and deaths. Its greatest talent has never been avoiding crisis. It has been changing just enough to survive one. And now, the question hanging over Buckingham Palace is not whether Prince William is already king. He isn't. It is something far more consequential. When the crown faces its next impossible choice, whose instincts will define the response? Charles's instinct to endure, or William's instinct to cut away the danger before it spreads? Because the moment that answer becomes clear, may be the moment the next reign truly begins.